Details on Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18. I'm Charley Walters. Since 2017, Dylan Fernandes has represented the Barnstable, Dukes, and Nantucket District in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. He sits on several committees, including the House Committee on Global Warming and Climate Change, and is the Vice Chair of the Joint Committee on Tourism, Arts, and Cultural Development. I'm delighted to welcome Dylan Fernandes back to this show. Thank you, Dylan.
It's great to be here.
We were talking before the show. We both think this is the fourth time you've been on, but neither of us is positive. Anyway, the more times you come on, the better. We always need to hear what you have to say.
What's the record?
You have the record, I believe.
All right, all right.
So congratulations. Well, let's get right to it. I just need to get out of your way and have you tell us what's going on Beacon Hill that will interest people watching this program.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's good to be with you. And I was actually supposed to be on Nantucket tomorrow for office hours, meetings on mental health, and meetings with folks in the art community as the vice chair of the Tourism, Arts, and Culture Committee. But I just found out a couple hours ago I have COVID, so I got my tea ready for this interview, and we'll be stuck inside this house for the next couple of days. But what's going on at the State House is quite a bit since we last chatted. We passed a number of nation-leading bills around the climate change, around immigrant rights, around voting, all of which I'd be happy to get into. And so far from our office, we've passed 9 bills just in the past year up at the State House, 3 of which were specific to Nantucket, were Nantucket home rule petitions. One that were sent to us through town meeting, one dealing with the airport and having more flexibility around accessing federal funding, one doing a land transfer between the town and I believe the land bank around expanding to expand bike path lanes, and another around the Nantucket Audit Committee. And we're still working on a number of other pieces of legislation specific to Nantucket, but so far I've already passed 3 Nantucket bills.
Tell us what the Audit Committee is.
Yeah, so this bill was sent to us. It was voted on by a town meeting, and it just aims to increase government transparency by adding 2 at-large members to the Nantucket Audit Committee. It's a really kind of small technical change. These types of bills, they don't get voted on by the entire legislature. They get voted on in an informal session because they're just not of the magnitude for the full legislature to take on and be privy to. But it's something that our office has to file and shepherd through the committee process, making it through 3 committees and then getting it to the floor where it's passed in informal session.
Let me look a little bit ahead and talk to you as the vice chair of, or as a member of the Climate Change Committee. Nantucket obviously has some huge issues with climate change, rising seas, but I'm looking at it in the context of the entire Commonwealth, because for a very small state, Nantucket has, or rather Massachusetts has, an awful lot of coastline. Is it too early to say how much of this is going to be addressed by the state or the feds or by the local governments? Because this is a very expensive project for all the coastal communities in the Commonwealth.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, I think there's no question that we need more federal support because there's just so much more money at the federal level. And we've seen that, some of the ARPA money we have diverted to use for coastal resiliency and climate resiliency. So we've already allocated, I believe, around $600 million to those types of projects with ARPA funds, and we'll be taking up more ARPA funds in the future. And then as a state, we passed a multi-billion-dollar bond bill that is all about coastal resiliency and hardening in places that should be hardened, and coming up with nature-based solutions, which is probably significantly more important in places where that makes sense as well. But before we did all of that, we passed legislation called the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness legislation, MVP program. And so this was to give towns, every town across the Commonwealth, the resources to go in and assess the impacts of their communities from climate change, sea level rise, flooding, you name it, all of the impacts. And then it directed those towns with that funding to come up with a comprehensive plan on how they're going to deal with it. Because, before we even start spending money on this, we need to know, okay, which areas, no matter how much money you're going to spend, are going to be gone in 50 years. So it's not worth allocating dollars there. Which places are going to need to be, retreated from, and when, what critical town and state infrastructure is in areas that are really vulnerable to sea level rise. And so that was something we passed last session. Towns have now come up with their plans. Then we pass a bond bill to help fund some of these plans. Then we use ARPA funding to help fund some of them. But this is going to be an incredibly expensive undertaking, and there's a lot more we need to do around it, and a lot more. We're going to need a lot more funding from the federal and state level to address it.
Well, the facts and figures that scientists are coming up with are always being updated. It's a bit of a moving target. How much more difficult does that make your job?
It doesn't. It's, the bottom line is that if we don't take action to reduce fossil fuels, we're going to live, future generations are going to live in, chaos. And so that's kind of the macro bottom line on this. And we've already seen how climate change is making us sicker, poorer, more vulnerable. And it has compounding effects on people who are already in those experiencing vulnerability. And so really, that's why we need, as a state, to be a leader in, yes, adapting to climate change, but even more importantly, in my mind, is reducing our impact and reducing fossil fuel use. And so that's the biggest bill that we took up this year. This session, it was this time last year, was around mandating that Massachusetts get to net zero by 2050 to hit, some of the, basically the benchmark climate goals that scientists set a couple of years ago. And then, not only do we say we're going to hit net zero by 2050, but we break that out by sector with real benchmarks and goals for every couple of years. And so that's good for a number of reasons. One, it's not just aspirational. We actually have a roadmap on how to hit those goals. And then if we don't hit those goals, because it's a law that we pass, we can be sued and forced to hit those goals. So it's not only making sure we're hitting them, but holding ourselves accountable to hit them. And that's, I think that's probably the most important and critical piece of legislation on climate that's ever been passed in our state's history, that we passed this time last year.
Now, your district, as I said, is Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, parts of Falmouth. Are the Elizabeth Islands in there too?
Of course.
Okay. I know Nantucket's population is going up. I assume Martha's Vineyard's population is going up as well as Falmouth. Do I have that right? You've got more and more people living in your district?
Yeah, our population exploded. I think I'm representing more people than any other state rep in the state at the moment.
Is that right? No kidding.
Yeah. Yeah, so
Well,
the islands grew by about 8,000. Falmouth grew, I think, somewhere between 1 and 2,000. So I'm representing right now around like 56,000 people, which is about 10,000 more than the allocation should be.
maybe you should get a pay raise.
I mean, that's you tell them that no, I mean, so what really is actually going to happen is our district's going to change with the redistricting, because that's we hit the redistricting point this year, and so next year we're losing one precinct from the district in Falmouth, and so that's what's gonna happen. We went through a redistricting process this past year that redrew several maps. We had a priority on the House side, I think the Senate too, on trying to draw more majority minority maps to empower traditionally communities that didn't have a minority representative representing a minority community. So that's something we focused on. And then we had to redraw a little bit of the Cape and Islands because, despite projections and initial thoughts that there might be a decrease in population, our population actually grew on Cape Cod and then exploded on Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket.
The topics we're talking about obviously are in your district, but I'm wondering for those non-coastal communities, for example, which are most of the municipalities in Massachusetts, is it hard to convince those non-coastal municipalities that all this money needs to be spent near Boston, Cape Cod, the islands?
On climate resiliency?
Yes.
No, I think those are communities that understand it, and they also, just because you're not on the coast doesn't mean that your community is not incredibly vulnerable to climate change and the effects that come with it. So, for instance, there's been increased flooding all over the state, not just on coastal communities, but we've seen a dramatic increase in our rainfall here. That's due to climate change, and a lot of communities are experiencing flooding in ways that they never have before. There's experiences with, on the flip side of that, some places are also experiencing droughts like they haven't before in some places in the state. And then, there's all these other effects too, migrating species, the warmer weather's impact on agriculture in the state, and, from here to Western Mass. And so there's not a single community in the Commonwealth that isn't going to be dramatically impacted by climate change and need funding to address its impacts.
We were talking a moment ago about increase in population, and just yesterday I was looking at some bus schedules from the Cape up to Boston, because I have to go up to Boston. Mm-hmm. And in spite of the fact that there are a lot more people living on the Cape and Islands, it seemed that there were fewer scheduled bus trips between the Cape and Boston. And I'm wondering if you agree with that, if I'm looking at the schedule correctly, and if that's the case, is this a matter of people working at home?
Yeah, so I actually don't know what the historical versus now bus schedule is. But that could be right. I mean, so the buses aren't subsidized. They're not something that the state pays for. And so it's private entities that do it, like Peter Pan or the Plymouth and Brockton bus line. But we have seen an uptick in the regional transit authorities. That's something that does get state funding. You have the NRTA on Nantucket, which is a regional transit authority that gets a lot of funding from the state through the budget, but then also through tickets from passengers. And so it's kind of a public-private partnership of sorts. But yeah, the buses, I'm not particularly sure. I do know that, now with the Cape Flyer, the train that comes to the Cape, there's been increased traffic there. And that's a service that people are continuing to discover and use. The bridges are going to be replaced pretty soon. I'm not sure what exactly impact that will have on traffic. I expect probably not a lot in terms of the amount of traffic coming over, but certainly it will ease, hopefully will ease some of the bottlenecks that you see.
I remember when I had you on, I think 3 years ago, there was talk of a third bridge. And I remember asking you about it. And you said something to the effect of, that ain't going to happen.
To Nantucket?
No, not to Nantucket.
I know, I'm joking. Yeah, no, there's not going to be a third bridge. Yeah. I mean, look, so the bridges are owned by the Army Corps of Engineers. They looked at everything. There wasn't they looked at literally everything. One of the things they looked at was whether filling in the canal, whether that was, whether that made economic sense.
I hadn't heard about
it. It turns out it does not. But to say that, considering that was on the list, they really looked at everything, including a third bridge as a more serious option. And what is going to happen is that the bridges are going to be replaced, but they are going to keep the Bourne and the Sagamore. The Sagamore will keep being in operation as the new bridge is being built. So there won't be any portion of time where there's only one bridge going on and off the Cape. Mm-hmm. So one bridge is going to be built first. It's looking like that is going to be the Sagamore. The Sagamore will stay up while the bridge next to it is being replaced. As soon as the bridge opens, I think the Sagamore is going to be disbanded, and the same thing's going to happen with the Bourne Bridge in a similar cadence. That's the plan right now, and that's been moving along for a couple of years now. Although certainly not fast enough when you talk to transportation experts about it.
I think a lot of people are very relieved to hear what you just said, that there will not be a single bridge at any time going over the canal.
That would be a nightmare. So I think we're all relieved. Yeah.
Several nightmares. Let's switch over to tourism, arts, and cultural development in your district. I'm assuming that you're expecting a huge tourist season for the Cape and Islands. That's what I'm hearing here.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're anticipating. If you look at the room occupancy numbers, it seems to be pointing in that direction. And we got really fortunate in a way with COVID, in that we had and it wasn't nearly a normal summer in 2020, but because we got our handle on our pandemic, going into summer, that we still had a relatively active summer in 2020. And then I think the most active summer of all time the year after. And now I think we're just building on that trend. I was appointed this session to a leadership position, serving as the vice chair of the Committee on Tourism, Arts, and Culture. And this is a huge industry for our district. It is the biggest industry in our district. And we have, people come here for our pristine ocean environment, but they really stay for our incredible cultural offerings. And whether that's playhouses or movie theaters, or entrepreneurs creating jewelry or pottery, or what different sorts of artwork. We've really become, on top of a beach destination, an artist and cultural destination. And so that's an industry that was impacted more than any other during the pandemic, along with the restaurant industry as well. And that fits under this tourism umbrella. And so we need to do everything we can to make sure that that industry is supported. And so, we've passed more money in cultural funding in the past several years than ever before to help regrow the industry and jumpstart the industry coming out of COVID. And we've done a lot around restaurants as well. We just recently extended outdoor dining, for instance, which I know has been pretty popular on Nantucket. And it's actually, when I walk around Nantucket and see outdoor dining, it's pretty cool to see. It's almost like you're walking in, in Venice or Florence or something. So that's been a real help for restaurants during a tough time as well.
Is it possible, this is a related subject, do you foresee a situation where the state gasoline tax would be dropped on a temporary basis?
No, that's not going to happen. The tax is pretty small relative to overall gas prices. And then on top of that, that tax is based upon that tax revenue is a function of how we bond to pay for our roads and bridges. And so if we take that out, we are significantly reducing our bonding capacity and the formulas there for funding roads and bridges that, definitely need a lot of help and repair in the state. So, and when you bond off of a revenue stream, that money goes, 4 to 10x higher. So it would be taking, dropping, a fractional percent of the overall cost per gallon and that would end up costing us and losing out from significantly more money in roads and bridges funding that our state desperately needs.
Let me ask you about something semi-controversial, and that's this proposal to change the makeup of the Steamship Authority, which came up, I guess, for the first time this month, or at least that was the first time I heard about it. What's going on with that?
Yeah, so this comes from, the Nantucket didn't experience this, but this legislation comes out of a time when the Steamship Authority literally just failed to exist for the island of Martha's Vineyard. And so I don't know if folks remember, it did make national news, but, memory is, who can remember what happened a couple of days ago, let alone back in 2018. But, in a short period for the vineyard, the Steamship Authority missed over 550 boat trips. One boat ran aground, another lost power and just kind of was stranded people for hours and hours. There are so many mechanical issues at one point that half of all the vessels were out of commission. And so this was a time of profound fear and anxiety and frustration on Martha's Vineyard. Thousands of people on island were stranded. And it had some real health and safety concerns related to it as well, as you can understand. So the islanders were, very upset about this, and they called upon the Steamship Authority to do a deep dive audit into the management. Julian Sear and I, joined that call and asking them to do a deep dive audit into their operations.
Julian Sear being
after
our state senator.
He's
our state senator.
Yeah, that's right.
Thanks
for the clarification. Yeah. So, and then they spent $250,000 on an audit report by a group of consultants. And the report, I recommend people read it. It's about 150 pages long. And frankly, it is really damning about the steamship's operations and showed a culture of mismanagement and complacency and a lack and a culture of just responding to the issue or problem of the day rather than coming up with some long-term thinking and long-term processes. And so they needed to make changes. And the report outlined a number of changes that the steamship should make. They made a number of them. Some of them they didn't make. One of which was around chief operating officer position. The report clearly outlined that this is something the steamship should have so that they can have longer term vision and planning and be better managed. But they didn't do that. They didn't take up that recommendation. And so we filed legislation putting that in there. We also included in that legislation a cap on term limits of 9 years for members serving on the board, also to get at kind of the what's outlined about kind of a culture of complacency at the steamship that comes in over time and led to the steamship literally breaking for 25,000 residents and tens of thousands of more people who use the line to Martha's Vineyard. So that was filed. The steamship then took up that recommendation around the COO position. So we've then, and they're implementing that now, which is good. And so we've taken that out of the bill. And then the Steamship Authority actually reached out to us to request legislation around their reporting cadence. And so for state audit reports. So, this just goes back, the steamships from original legislation from the 1960s. And so, they used to, in the original legislation, you'd report an audit report to the state every April. They wanted to move it to July or the end of June to kind of meet up with the fiscal year. And so we're going to do that. We basically swapped in that provision for them instead of the COO position. So that's where the legislation is right now. And that was the reasoning behind it.
I have a vague recollection of what was going on in 2018, but it sounds to me that Nantucket was very lucky not to have had the same problems Martha's Vineyard had.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, right. It could have just as easily been Nantucket. It just so happened it was your sister island that experienced that profound hurt. And by the way, like, they don't have a high line, right? So if the steamship breaks for them, that's it. There's nothing else. And so, even if the steamship broke for you guys, it would be profoundly disruptive. But at the very least, you do have the High Line there, which is licensed out by the steamship and allowed to operate by the steamship. But the vineyard has nothing. And so, look, we want to make sure this never happens again. And we take what happened with the steamship breaking and stranding tens of thousands of islanders incredibly seriously. This isn't a big bill by any stretch of the imagination, but I called the auditors who did the report, had a lengthy conversation with them about it. They seem to think that these changes were necessary to ensure that this is a lifeline that does well and by people who are on the island and provides that reliable service.
I suppose you could compare it to what would happen if the Mass Turnpike was suddenly out of commission from 495 into Boston. Then what are you supposed to do to get around? I mean, it would be a nightmare. But also, I think people tend to overlook the fact that even though the Steamship Authority is serving the Cape and the islands, or parts of the Cape and the islands, it is a state authority.
So
one reason why you get in the act.
Yeah, well, it's quasi-gov. So it kind of operates in a similar way that Massport does, and that it is a state-enabled monopoly. And so it exists in legislative statute. And so, I've heard some concerns from people about, oh, what happens when you open up the steamship legislative statute, which, I don't mean to diminish those concerns or make fun of them, but we opened up the steamship statute 2 years ago, and heard none of these concerns. And that was actually over a much more significant issue, which was around making sure that towns that are in the port communities, chiefly Nantucket and the Vineyard, weren't liable for any COVID-related deficits that the steamship incurred. And so for people who don't know, if the steamship operates at a deficit, those deficits then go back to the port communities to pay for them at a rate that is proportional to the vote share on the steamship board. And so for Nantucket, that's 35%. For the Vineyard, that's 35%. When we first got the call from the steamship about their potential operating deficits because of COVID, they were looking at a deficit at the high range could have been around $75-80 million. So that would have been a ton of money that Nantucketers would have had to have paid if luckily as I mentioned earlier, the economy ticked up. We largely, we had a relatively COVID-free summer. It certainly wasn't COVID-free, but it was about as COVID-free as you could get in 2020 summer. And things went pretty well. So that didn't come to pass, but we had to change the statute for the SSA so that Nantucket wouldn't be liable for those, what at the time was multi-million-dollar bill. And so, none of these, so there was no kind of unfounded, a lot of these fears are unfounded. And then also, the Steamship Authority, it is in legislative statute. So you have to, there are some things you literally have to change through the legislature to get to have the steamship operate properly. Like in a couple of years from now, we're going to have to open up the steamship statute again because the bond authorization number for the steamship is in legislative statute. And that's going to need to be raised as the steamship looks to buy additional boats, as inflation, inflationary pressures increase. And then also, the biggest thing that's coming for the steamship is, which is totally separate from a whole different discussion, is that they're going to have to be net zero by 2050. And so the Steamship Authority is going to and the High Line and every ferry system in the state, but obviously ours is the largest, is going to have to transition to electric and hybrid electric ferries in the next 30 years. And that is going to be a massive undertaking that's going to take a lot of investment by the ferry systems, also by the state, and also by the utility companies to ensure that that happens.
A real can of worms.
That's a much bigger issue than chief operating officer or decade term limits. That's for sure.
Well, I'm glad I asked that because I got a much longer answer and a much more complicated answer than I would have thought, which is all to the good. So, thank you for that information. Now, this is an even numbered year, and that means that all the state reps are up for re-election this year. Are you running for re-election?
Yeah, I am. I've been here for 5 years so far, and I'd like to at least keep serving for one more term. I love doing this work. I love serving Nantucket. It's been really kind of the joy of my lifetime to be able to serve this district, which is incredibly unique and beautiful. And it's been a joy to get to know so many awesome Nantucketers that I now call friends. So I'm looking forward to it. I want to keep fighting for Nantucket. I feel like we're just hitting we're really hitting our stride now in terms of some really large legislative accomplishments. So I'm going to run for one more term. We'll see what happens after that. But yeah, I'm up for re-election and would really appreciate people's support.
Have you made a formal announcement yet?
I don't think I have, but I probably should do that. Yeah, maybe this is it right here. This is you heard it here first on
You heard it first on
Profiles of
Community
Charley
Television.
Yeah.
You used to work for Maura Healey,
Hmm?
and she is currently our Attorney General. She is running for governor. As a layperson, just reading the papers and listening to the news, it looks as though she has a very good chance of being the next governor. That would mean that the governor's office and the general court were controlled by Democrats. Obviously, that's what you want. But I'm wondering if, and this is based on listening to Jim Browdy talk the other night on Channel 2, are there pitfalls to having one-party government, not just in Massachusetts, right? As a general topic? Will that make your job easier if the governor is also Democratic?
Yeah, well, it makes passing nation-leading legislation a whole lot easier. So, for instance, what this nation-leading climate legislation that we passed, the governor vetoed that twice, and then we had to override his vetoes. And so it makes the vote math for really good, it's my opinion, but good legislation a whole lot easier. For instance, one piece of legislation that we just passed, which is a huge deal for Nantucket, is around allowing undocumented immigrants to be able to drive and giving them a license. This is a huge issue that, is just about road safety and also about family mobility, because undocumented immigrants, which are, there's a huge proportion in our communities and especially on the islands, they need to drive their kids to school. They are kids in school, and they need to get to soccer practice, to work, you name it. But not having access to be able to drive is, I think, just really a big quality of life issue. And we've also seen that when states allow this, they see a higher tick up in insurance rates, and they see a decrease in hit and run incidences. So not only is this good for undocumented immigrants who are working in our communities, but it's also good for everyone in terms of road safety. The governor has said he's going to veto it, right? And so then we need to ensure that we have the votes to override it. And on some things like that, we don't. And with a Democratic governor, some of these more impactful nation-leading pieces of legislation that Massachusetts is known for, like gay marriage, for instance, or universal health care. Although that was done under Romney, I can't remember if he did sign it into law. So there are instances where it does overlap. But more forward-thinking legislation is certainly easier to get done with a Democratic governor.
Well, Dylan, I appreciate your coming by for what we think is the fourth time. I'm glad to have a scoop on your announcing you are running for re-election in November. I'm sure we'll see a lot more of you on Nantucket in the months to come. You're here a lot anyway, but I'm sure you'll be here even more as you campaign. So I wish you luck with your campaign, and thank you for coming on this show.
It's a pleasure as always, and I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing you and Nancy on island at some point. And I'll be on island very soon. And sad I can't be there tomorrow as I was scheduled to be, but we're there at least once, sometimes twice a month. So we're there pretty often.
Well, the next time I see you, I hope it's in person and not on a screen. But again, thank you and best of luck to you.
Oh, and I'll just say, and I'm sorry, I know we're trying to end, but if any Nantucketer has any state-related issues that they need help with, they should reach out to my office. We helped hundreds of islanders get on unemployment insurance during the pandemic. And we can help you if that's something you're struggling with. And really, if there's just anything that comes up that is, you're dealing with the state on and need help with, let us know. And we've been fighting really hard with the RMV around ensuring that they get their act together and have more regular hours on Nantucket as well. So I know that's been a source of frustration and something we're working on as well.
A lot of people will be ecstatic to hear what you just said. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And if people do want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
So if you just Google Dylan Fernandes, the MA legislature page should be the first thing that comes up. And then my email and office number are right there. Email me. I check my own email like 2 or 3 times a day. I'll personally get back to you. So please reach out.
Good to know.
Yeah.
Dylan, thank you again. We'll hope to see you soon.
My pleasure. Take care.
For Profiles on Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18, I'm Charley Walters. Thank you for tuning in, and please tune in again.